Hi everyone, good afternoon. Today we are resuming the Lisbon Speed Talks, and we have today Dr. Aisha Ozori to speak about what happened to coup d'etat in Africa. Dr. Aisha Ozori is the Executive Director of the Open Society Initiative for West Africa, a grant-making and advocacy organization based in Dakar, Senegal. She's a lawyer, writer, and development practitioner with experience in the public and private sectors. I'd like, on behalf of the Club de Lisboa, to thank and express our deep appreciation to Dr. Aisha Ozori for being available to join us today. Thank you so much. Dr. Aisha Ozori is going to speak on a theme that gained recently renewed visibility with the coup d'etat in Mali. Contrary to what had been happening until the first decade of this century, the usual coup d'etat in Africa suffered a sharp decrease, apparently the result of a more concerted performance by international actors and African institutions. I underline apparently. We may eventually find other stronger and more consistent explanations. Dr. Aisha Ozori intervention will take around 10-12 minutes, and then we'll focus and we'll follow the questions by the audience who can post questions or commentaries, either in Portuguese or in English, on the live stream chat. Without further delay, I pass the floor to you. So, Aisha, the audience is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the generous introduction, Carlos. I wish I was a doctor, but I'm just plain old Aisha. I haven't earned that title yet. And thank you for inviting me. I have to say that I chuckled when I revisited the title for this conversation, and thinking that when we chose this topic months ago and agreed on it, little did we know that there would be a fresh coup in Mali. Just weeks before this conversation, but the title is still quite valid. So I just want to spend a little time on the history of coups. Generally, coups are a part of our global history. Obviously, we've had coups since 876 BC, before Christ, when the very first leader of a coup that's captured Zimri, a military commander of Israel, kills his king and becomes the king himself. And from that time on, we've been recording coups all across the globe. Back home to Sub-Saharan Africa, the first technical coup was in Togo in January of 1963. I say technical because 2 years earlier, there had been a violent overthrow of an elected president, Lumumba, of DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. But academics don't count that particular overthrow as a coup for some reason, because they see it as something that was led and directed not by the citizens and the military per se, but on the instigation of Western powers. And the other second reason that I say first technical coup was because, in my mind, colonialism and the partitioning of Africa was a coup of sorts, because it overthrew existing governments and it overthrew governance structures. But that said, since that time, we've had a really violent history of coups. In fact, before 1990, and 1990 is usually used as the mark where we saw the current wave of democratization that we're enjoying begin. But before that time, between 1960s to 1990, we had at least 76 successful coups. This doesn't count the attempted coups and the failed coups, and of which there were over 100. So if you look at it in its totality, you'd see that we'd had close to 200 coups or attempted coups between 1960s and 1990. Now, post 1990, we saw that the number of successful coups dropped to about 28 between 1990 and now. And this includes changes in power that were driven not by the military, but by citizens in Burkina Faso, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Mali, and in Cote d'Ivoire, to mention a few. So if we're including that number, you see that that means the successful coups since 1999 are actually even less than 28. We've seen, in fact, a drop in 40% of coups on an annual basis across the continent. So it's been fantastic. But to understand what happened to coups in Africa, we have to know why they were popular in the first place. So what's the context in which the coups were taking place in Africa in the early 1960s up to the early 1990s? And I have three reasons that I'd like to share. The first reason is, I think post-independence, the post-independence wave of African countries gaining independence from colonial powers was that many governments started unraveling pretty quickly, typically because of a mix of unpreparedness of those who were in leadership to lead, faulty exploitative structures, which made it difficult to deliver the benefits of self-rule and democracy to citizens, and which also fell into a breakdown of law and order and the loss of monopoly over the use of violence, which the military now took as an excuse to come in. And usually they would always come in to say, we want to restore law and order, just as they've done in Mali 2 weeks ago. Now, the second reason why coups were popular was because in many of these countries that were newly becoming independent, a few of the leaders were not liked, and I'm using that word softly, were not liked by the former colonialists. So, for example, Togo, where the first coup in Sub-Saharan Africa took place, there was the government advisor on Africa policy in France, Jacques Faucart, was quoted as saying, Olympio was never our friend. So Olympia was the president who was overthrown and killed in 1963. And so you can see that, yes, there was also that underlying tone that where you had leaders in these countries that were not towing the line of the former colonial powers, very likely they would not last in that position. And underlying this as well was the implications of the international ideological war between communism and capitalism, which made this dislike deadlier, if you would like to frame it that way. So we also saw that in many of these countries where coups were happening right after after gaining independence, you'd see that sometimes the leaders were gazing towards the East, so to speak, communism, Cuba, Russia, and that was considered an absolute no-no by the Western powers, typically the US, the UK, France, and Co. And then the third reason why coups were popular was that, again, in some cases, there was just the issue that some of the people who had come into leadership post-independence became authoritarians very quickly. They consolidated power, they started cracking down on opposition, and they made it such that there was no legitimate way to change power and to resolve political and social issues apart from through coups. And so those are the three reasons why coups were gaining prominence in Africa around that period, those decades. So how did coups now become unpopular to the point where we saw that the successful numbers of coups dropped to 28? Well, several things also happened. The first one was, well, the Cold War was over. Around 1990, the Cold War was typically over, and coups were declared unpopular by the international community. And for the first time, this was backed up with sanctions, exclusions from democracy clubs. A lot of aid money was conditional on transitions from military to civilian rule. A lot of aid money was pumped into civil society to help citizens mobilize and organize around demands for elections and an end of military rule. And this was successful. So this triggered the second reason why we now saw a decline in coups in Africa. And this was that this framing of coups as bad and democracy as good, it actually started working. People started enjoying democracy, the freedoms of democracy, freedoms of speech, movements, being able to criticize, being able to change governments. So countries quickly developed these tools to resolve political and social conflicts, which did not need coups anymore. So you could even see that we were also changing. So not only were we enjoying the benefits of democracy, we were also being able to change our presidents and heads of states without political coups. In a research piece by two writers, Alexander and Omotola, they point out that between 1990 and 2017, for 62.6% of the presidential elections were won by the incumbent, and 11.8% were lost by the incumbents, meaning that incumbents were also even losing elections, and this was giving people a comfort in the fact that their votes were counting. And again, this made the need for violent coups less important and less vital. There's also another reason why coups became less popular, and this speaks to what Carlos mentioned in the introduction, that African organizations themselves and institutions such as the AU, the African Union, and the other regional economic blocs such as ECOWAS, SADC, they were all strongly against unconstitutional means for accession of power. In 2007, the AU framed and adopted the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, and made it really clear that they would not accept any unconstitutional means of gaining power, and and actually put in certain provisions, including technical things like trying to limit the ability of incumbents to change constitutions that they would benefit from while they're still in power. And finally, another thing that made coups less popular was that some say, and this one is debatable, some say that the military became more educated, more aware. They became more aware of the values of freedom. They could see what the people were enjoying and were so less likely to get involved in political issues. Others argue that this is not the case and that the military are always and still lurking. And we can use Egypt as an example. It's very hard pressed to think of anyone who can become president in Egypt without the support of the military. I would say it's almost the same thing in Nigeria, which is my home country. It's very unlikely that anyone can become the president without the backing of the military. And so others argue that no, it's not that the militaries value freedom, it's just that the military are now more strategic about how they use their power, and that the heavy defense budgets that we see are to the detriment of investments in public services such as education and health are the reason why the military is quiet. So basically, they're being bribed, so to speak, to stay in the barracks. So what does the future hold, especially after what's going on? We've seen Sudan last year, where the people's protest was hijacked by the military, and then they now overthrew Bashir, and are now also in power, claiming to be working out a transition government, where you see that many of the people who are part of Bashir's government are now still part of the transition government. You now wonder, wasn't that another stolen? This is another case of stealing the victory of the people. The same exact thing happened in Mali. The people of Mali have been protesting since June, losing their lives, and then suddenly the military come in to create order, and they come into place. So what do we see happening? I think right now the entire world is facing democratic regressions, due in part to the new Cold War, which is an economic one as well, no longer between capitalism and communism, but now about those for globalization and those who are against globalization. In the last year, I mentioned we've seen Sudan and Mali, and within the last 5 years, generally, we've seen attempts at coups in Turkey and Yemen. So as populism and nationalism rise, it seems as if democracy is going to be less fashionable, and it's very likely that the international community will be more tolerant of political oppression and the abuse of power. I can already give two examples. Within West Africa, the region where I work, we can see that Guinea, the president of Guinea, Alpha Conde, just announced yesterday that he will be running for a third term. This is something that has been heavily disputed by citizens who have been protesting since last year, losing their lives, but he still managed to push through the coronavirus, holding a referendum, changing the constitution, and now he wants to run for a third term. What is the international community going to do about that? Same thing in Cote d'Ivoire. We've seen a turn where Ouattara, on the loss of his dolphin, Amadou Gon Coulibaly, has now turned around and interpreted the constitution to allow himself to run for the third term. We can see again clearly that this is unconstitutional. So it's not exactly a coup, but it is a way of stealing government in a way that you'd say could preempt or could trigger a coup. So if we don't start paying attention to these things when they happen, we could see more coups happening to redress these types of injustices against the people. And unfortunately, there's no case where when the military comes in, you can say it was a good thing that they did. So it just sort of compounds the issues. Another danger that we see is that elections, and I think I alluded to that earlier, elections are becoming less and less democratic. And yet we're equating the frequency of elections with democracy. So elections don't make democracy. But as long as the country is holding elections regularly, we seem to say, okay, it's okay. We're not paying attention to the fact that these elections are rigged, which is sort of some of what we're seeing in Belarus, for example. So if the global community and international community continues to accept rigged elections, then they will also be making coups likely. Back to Mali, what triggered the protest in Mali in June, in addition to the insecurity, in addition to the rising allegations of corruption against the president, nepotism, there was also the issue of the last parliamentary elections, which happened in April, and the sense from citizens that those elections were rigged to ensure that Ibaka, that's the president, President Boubacar Keita, would be able to retain a majority. They were very upset about that. So if we don't pay attention to elections, we don't make sure that elections are free and fair and people's votes count, we will find that citizens will agitate, they might not be able to overthrow, and then the military will come back. That said, there are a few good positives from this quiet time, these decades of fewer coups that we've seen. So there are hundreds of millions of African youth, the largest demographic obviously on the continent, who have never lived under military rule and have not experienced any coups. Hopefully, they are very enamored with their democracy and their freedoms and will do their best to protect it. We've also seen a rise in social movements. So, for example, between 1997 and 2010, we had less than 7,000 protests across Sub-Saharan Africa. But from 2011 to 2016, just 5 years, we saw about 20,000 different protests across Sub-Saharan Africa. So there's more and more. And when you look at any of these surveys from Afrobarometer, you see that many Africans are saying we prefer democracy, we prefer democracy. There is a sense that people are getting jaded. They're becoming a bit disheartened that democracy is not giving them the dividends that they want, but they still think that democracy is better than military rule. So for me, that's the positive that we can hold on to. And if we're preemptive about these things that I talked about, we are likely to see that we can keep coups at bay, but we're actually right now in a very dangerous time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for your very interesting intervention and very comprehensive. Actually, you raised a couple of quite important issues. We have several questions. The first one asks, in this decline of coups, is there a special role for the African Union as a mediator? And I also would like one question from my side with this one. Is it possible to establish any connection between the security sector reform efforts, those carried out by the European Union, and the concrete cultural evolution of the military in Africa, embracing democratic values? Okay, we can start with this one, and then.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so about the role of the African Union, yes, there is. I mean, the African Union has played a role so far. They have played a very strong role because they've come out unequivocally, as I mentioned, with the Africa Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance in 2007. And so they've been very firm, and they have been firm. We've seen examples in Gambia. We've seen when Yahya Jammeh lost the elections in 2017 and tried to walk his way back, and they were very firm about it, along with ECOWAS. So they do play that role. I think what AU could do more of is being a bit more proactive about reading the signs that are coming. So, for example, we could all see the signs that were coming in Mali, the same way I pointed out that we can see the signs coming in Guinea and in Cote d'Ivoire. But they're not saying anything now. So sometimes you want them to be proactive, to sort of read the tea leaves and say, this danger is coming, let us intervene now. But unfortunately, in many of the cases, the AU representatives are representatives of their home countries. So, for example, I'd like to think that the commissioners from Nigeria would be sort of gazing towards the government and looking to them for direction, which is not good for the independence that we need from the AU. So the AU does play a special role, can play a special role, but also needs to improve what it does in terms of its risk analysis and how proactive it can be. On the second question, Carlos asked about we want to understand it properly, the link between, Carlos, could you repeat that question? The military?
If it's possible to establish a connection, a link between the security sector reforms conducted by several international organizations and the European Union in particular, with an evidence of a cultural evolution of the military in Africa, especially embracing democratic values.
To be honest, I think it would be a very tenuous link. I think it will be really extremely hard to make that link between the support that we're getting from EU, the increased funding and interest in the Sahel, and even just extra money, extra soldiers, with a sense that the military has actually changed their minds about how they operate with citizens. And I'd like to give an example. In Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are constantly flagging countries. Nigeria is one of them, Mali is one of them, where the soldiers are extremely brutal with the civilians. In fact, in many cases, people are actually saying they're making it easier for the jihadists to uh, recruit citizens onto the side of the jihadists because of how badly they've been treated, killing them, killing their family, treating them hardly. So there's very little evidence to show that there's any cultural revolution. One of the things that OSIWA is doing, the organization that I work with as a grant-making organization, we're actually in the process of trying to design a curriculum in partnership with the military in Nigeria, trying to include a human rights angle to the training curriculum for soldiers, especially officers, just to help them see that. But this is funding that's not tied to the EU. So what we could see actually is an opportunity for the EU, the UN, the MINUSMA, and all the people who are Germany, all the other countries who are funding and putting soldiers into the Sahel, into Mali, into all these countries that are facing Islamists and jihadists, is to try and spend a bit of that money on the cultural rewiring of the soldiers. We're not seeing enough of that. There is an opportunity, but I think right now we cannot make that link. There's no evidence.
Okay, loud and clear. Thank you so much. We have other question asking, in your opinion, what happened in Mali was a military coup d'etat, or the military were pushed to overthrow the regime? And also linked to this question, I would like that you comment the following statement of economist. Economists called the coup d'etat that overthrew the elected government in Mali as a coerced resignation rather than a full-blown military putsch. Could you comment these two questions, please?
Yes, sure. Thank you. So for the first question, what happened in Mali? Is it a coup d'etat or were they pushed? I to be honest, it is a hard question, and I've spent some time thinking about it as well. Was there any other option? It seemed as if the country was in a stalemate because the protests had been going on since June. They were very firm and they were consistent. They wanted the president out. There was no amount of negotiations. A lot of concessions were made by Keita, dissolving parliament, dissolving the constitutional court, bringing in people from the opposition. They were implacable. They wanted him out. At the same time, there was regional organizations such as ECOWAS. You were seeing that some of the presidents from some of the West African countries were all taking a different side, saying that no, because they didn't want to start a dangerous precedent. So they were all saying, no, you cannot get rid of Ibeka. You have to work with him. But at the same time, the country was deteriorating in terms of governance. There was no governance, there was no law and order, and insecurity was continuing to rise. And of course, this is during COVID, and this is during economic regression. So I can see how the military would feel they had no option but to come in. But at the same time, I think that it was wrong, because then they should have handed over to the opposition. That's what I think. But then, again, it's difficult, because then you now come to the question of how do you hand over to the opposition when they weren't democratically elected? But the military are also not democratically elected. So I would say that I would prefer to call it a coup, because that's what it was. Because at the same time, we're hearing now a bit of uncertainty about the transition plans. It seemed as if the military just acted in a knee-jerk reaction instead of thinking it through. They say they want 3 years. ECOWAS is insisting on 12 months. You'd like to think that if the military really did have the best intentions at heart, maybe they would have a plan to hand over as quickly as possible. That's, let's say, within 12 months. Let's not forget that Mali has had a history of coups before 2012, and then at 2012, and now again. So it is a coup. We should treat it as a coup, and we should be very firm about not accepting it under whatever circumstances. Let this be a lesson to the ECOWAS and to the other presidents to be able to read the tea leaves and to be able to come up with solutions, to not leave it open for the military to come in and take over. The economists call the coup a coerced resignation. I think that's just, you see, and that's the danger that I'm talking about, that when the international community starts seeing it as something that is, what's the word I'm looking for? Something that's, they want to find a soft way of accepting what has happened. So now they don't want to call it a coup, they want to call it a coerced resignation. But the truth is, it is a coup, and it could have been avoided if we had listened to the people and if we had made sure that the votes of the people counted in the first place. So no, I don't agree that it's a coerced resignation. It was a coup, and it could have been avoided. And we need the international community to be more firm about the legitimacy of elections. They should stop covering for African presidents who steal elections from people. That's the way to avoid coups.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Do you see any conceptual difference between the coup d'etat in Mali and the coup d'etat led, for instance, by al-Sisi in Egypt in 2013, when he overthrew the president Morsi, elected a year earlier following the transition after the Egyptian revolution in 2011?
I would say yes, and also put my answer a caveat that this is not, I'm not an expert in coups and I'm not an expert in military takeovers, so I know that there's probably a lot more nuance. But from what I've read and I know, the difference that I see is that with Morsi and Sisi, Morsi was, there's a difference and there's a similarity. So the difference is this: Morsi was clearly doing things to change the constitution, to amass powers that would have made it almost impossible to move him. And he had gotten the backup of the citizens. So the citizens were now against him. And that's where the similarity with Mali comes in. For whatever reason, Ibaka also had earned the disgust of citizens. They wanted him out at all costs. So that's where the similarities are. But in terms of the reason why and why it was necessary in Egypt as opposed to Mali, if I was going to wait, I could say I could understand why it was an urgent need for Egypt in a way that I would not accept for Mali, because in Mali, I think there was a way out. In Egypt, it seemed less clear. Again, there's no way that I accept unconstitutional grabs of power, but at the same time, those are the differences, that there was already going to be a run on the constitution in Egypt, which we are not seeing in Mali.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's go to a last question. What is your judgment on the supposed absolute neutrality of China in the international political affairs inside the African countries where its presence is well established?
Yeah. Yes. Again, I know that lots and lots have been written about this, and
that's great. Go ahead.
But I would say that honestly, it depends on how there's no absolute. I agree. Supposed absolute neutrality. You've already answered the question, Antonio, because there is no neutrality. You can't sit on the fence and say we're neutral. I think China sent a very bad signal to democracy in Africa. China is not a democratic nation itself, obviously, so it doesn't have those values. It doesn't respect those values. It wouldn't be seeking to protect those values in the countries in which it's engaging with. So I think that China is not neutral. They're sending a clear message to African dictators, to African rulers, and to their citizens, actually, indirectly, that we do not care about democracy. We just want to do our deals, get what we want to get from you guys, and go on your own. We don't really care. And I think we have many examples of how China deals with its own dissidents, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's the Uyghur Muslims. We've seen over and over again that China doesn't respect values, it doesn't respect democracy and freedom. So we can't expect that in Africa, when it says it's neutral, that it's actually neutral. It's not neutral.
Okay, thank you so much. We don't have any further questions, but we are just reaching our time. I would like to reiterate our thanks from the Clube de Lisboa, and I hope to engage with you again in other occasions. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks everybody who joined us today. My pleasure.
All the best.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.